The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Few protest movements become international calls to action. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. But tonight, as we wrap our look back at turning points of the past decade, we return to one that braved a global pandemic with our conversation about Black Lives Matter and the fight to end anti-Black racism. Also, our Ontario hubs take us to the historic Mackinac Island. The Black Lives Matter movement began in the United States in 2013 after the acquittal of a man accused in the shooting death of a Black teen, Trayvon Martin. And it expanded as protests erupted in Ferguson, Missouri in the summer of 2014 after police there shot and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown. But the movement gained worldwide prominence in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, whose death at the hands of police there was captured on video. The officer charged in Floyd's death was Derek Chauvin. He was found guilty of all charges in the murder of George Floyd and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Issues such as the central demand to defund the police made their way into the 2020 U.S. presidential election and continue to be called for by activists. The racial reckoning and protests of 2020 have led to greater calls for diversity and inclusion in government, business, public institutions, and sectors such as the media. There has also been pushback to last year's protests and the politicizing of teaching the history of anti-Black racism and what's called critical race theory in some American states. Here is our conversation less than 2 weeks after George Floyd's death last May.
I just want everybody's impressions on what you have been seeing in the streets, mostly of America, but also in Canada over the past several days. What about these protests, Sandy, has stood out for you most?
Honestly, the ubiquity of the protests. I've been so, inspired, saddened that so many people are struck by this, but inspired that so many people feel the need to demonstrate and say something, from Whitehorse all the way down to Miami. The strength that it takes to go out into the street, especially when, in the United States, there's been a lot of repression from the police in response. It can be very scary. And for people to put themselves out there like that really means that they're taking this problem of anti-Black policing very seriously and really want some sort of concrete change.
Kika, what has stood out for you the most?
I think the diversity of the of the folks coming out, I think, is really profound, and it's a little entry point into the conversation we need to be having, which is that this is not Black people's problem to fix. It's it's bigger than that. So I think the other piece I would just add is that how sustained it is. I think we're on the 11th day or night of protests in the US. And I would say here, the sustained piece is around the social media, at least the social media conversation. It has not slowed down even since last week.
Roger, how about you?
Yeah, I feel that from my perspective, I had a conversation with some men on Wednesday, so a group of Black men, and it's just the emotional toll that Black men are feeling right now. Nobody, and this group of men were all, very accomplished men, and we still feel as if it could happen to us. So this is nobody is exempt. No Black man is exempt from the possible unfair and unjust treatment from the police, and that in itself is scary and oftentimes depressing.
Akwasi.
Yeah, I think, echoing earlier points, the breadth and depth of these protests. So they went actually global very, very quickly. And obviously, they've continued throughout North America. And that especially in, the situation which we're currently in, which is one of a pandemic. So people putting their lives on the line, not only, at the risk of experiencing violence at the hands of the police, but also contracting a virus that can also be deadly. I think also, in the Canadian context, the prompting of conversations around systemic, or as I would prefer to say, structural racism, opposition to those denials, quick walking back, although, of course, we can question the kind of truth behind the statements amongst people like Doug Ford and the removal from boards of Stockwell Day, I think, to me have been important. Finally, perhaps unsurprising, but Donald Trump's kind of response to this, just kind of further entrenching his divisive form of politics that's, kind of characterized his leadership since the beginning.
Just, I don't know how important this is, but a little point of clarification. I don't know that Stockwell Day was removed from either of the boards. I believe he voluntarily resigned from those boards, having realized that what he said was didn't capture the nuances, let's say, of what's going on right now. Sandy, I do want to pick up on one of the themes that has emerged in light of the events of Minneapolis, and that is defund the police. We're hearing that more and more now. Can you tell us what your understanding of defund the police actually means?
Sure, and I just want to clarify that it's not just coming out of Minneapolis. This was something that we were saying back in 2016 when Andrew Loku was killed right here in Toronto. And so there does seem to be some consensus right now amongst activists across North America and beyond about this being the solution that we really need to focus on. And so what we mean when we say defund the police is that right now there are services that the police do not perform well, and in fact, in their performance of these services, continue to kill Black people. And that it can no longer be something that we accept as a society. We never should have. And instead, what we should do is take those services away from the police, implement new services that provide those safety measures, those security measures better than the police do. And by defunding the police, we free up funding that we can then use to invest in services that will tackle these issues better.
Okay, Kika, you want to give me an example of what that looks like on the ground?
Well, I mean, first of all, defunding happens all the time, right? So it's about the reuse or the new utilization of funds, the sort of shifting of resources and moving them around so that we're better answering, right? I'm thinking about, when I think about child welfare, for example, and the ways that people are the needs that people sort of show and the things that usually cause the police to be called. Certainly, there's a number of ways that we can be in prevention mode and utilizing the funds to support, the kind of services that people really need. So parenting support or, childcare. I mean, I think childcare is a great example. Childcare is extremely expensive in this province. And so if funding was used to support folks with that expense, there would be a lot of freeing up and sort of, better care for children. These are the things that often cause, calls to the police that are unnecessary, for example, in the context of child welfare. So just an example off the top of my head, but, I think when people hear defund, they hear that the police won't exist necessarily, or they'll be down to zero. And I think, but what has happened here is that officials, the decision makers around this piece, have been unwilling to come to the table. I mean, it's been a few days that this issue's been back on the table. And this, if you listen, the narrative is that's not an option. Now let's talk about these other things. And I think that is structural and systemic racism in action. You are talking to people who know. You should be willing to listen, because we are partners in the functioning of this city.
Roger, you have all laid out the case for systemic anti-Black racism in Canada. So let's talk about, and Roger, start us off here, how do you start to change attitudes around anti-Black racism here in Ontario, here in Canada?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to put the focus on where the real problems are. I've often said that as a community that is not the most, financially sustainable in this country. So therefore, when I look on the volume of drugs and crime that exists in Canada, we can't even afford to buy the billions of drugs that come into this country. So why is there so much focus on the Black community? We have an opioid crisis right now, and I think one of the things that we need to deal with outside of the Black community is just decriminalizing all drugs. So let's start with that, so we can get a little bit of less focus on the so-called, criminal activity that's happening in inner city communities. A lot of people that have been locked up for simple marijuana possession. If you even think back on George Floyd, he was killed for $20, a $20 bill. I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, you're not supposed to get the death penalty for what George Floyd did. There's no question about that.
No.
Sandy Hudson, why don't you pick up the story? What can we do today about changing attitudes about anti-Black racism in Canada?
I really think the only way forward is defunding the police. And I want to pick up on what was just said about decriminalizing drugs. That is a form of defunding the police. When we tackle an issue like the opioid crisis by investing in public health, setting up treatment centers, and making sure that people get the types of supports that they need, instead of criminalizing people and sending the police after them to incarcerate them or arrest them, that is one of the ways that we can defund the police, take money away from the police doing that activity and put it into the public health system to make sure that people get the supports that they need. Another form of defunding the police would be making a new emergency service that is specifically in place to deal with people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. There's lots and lots of evidence to suggest that the police are not well placed to deal with people who are having an emergency mental health crisis. That is what was happening with Regis Korchinski-Paquette here in Toronto, and also DeAndre Campbell, who was killed on his front lawn, an unarmed Black man killed on his front lawn in Brampton about a month ago. What if there was another option for people to call, another number, another service where the people who would show up would be health professionals who are trained in the social and health needs of these people. A program like this has already been put in place in Oregon, and it has been so successful they're scaling it up to Portland, the city of Portland. And so, these examples of how this could work exist elsewhere. So let's take all of that money that's going into the police in Toronto, that's $1.07 billion, take some of that money, put it into new services that are able to address these issues that we have in our communities better, provide better safety and better security services.
Kwasi, I want to talk to you about the politics of that, because, of course, there's no institution in society that's probably better at protecting its own budgets than the police. And when politicians have tried to rearrange budgets or cut budgets, the police are very good about making their case for status quo or increases. So what will be required to make the kinds of changes that Sandy just described?
Absolutely. I think immense pressure by the public on their politicians to make this happen will be required. You're completely right. Police services and, importantly, police associations and unions in the United States do a very good job of lobbying politicians and pressuring politicians to ensure that their resources are protected. And so if we want to see, the reallocation of responsibility and of resources, which is really what needs to happen here, right? Like in the context of the policing example, we're talking about the policing of poverty and homelessness, right? We're talking about policing in relation to mental health. And then, we can look at some of the communities in which my work focuses on. Many of the programs provided to young people in Toronto's marginalized neighborhoods include the involvement of the police. And I understand they come under the banner of crime prevention, right? These are mentoring programs, these are sports programs, these are other types of programs. But Now, I understand that there may be a crime prevention element to them, but there's also a crime prevention element to good prenatal care, and we don't have the police involved in that, right? So this rethink of the roles and responsibilities of the police, I think, needs to take place. I would call on Mayor John Tory to establish a task force within the city, not the police service board or the police service, to do an audit of all of the functions and the responsibilities that the Toronto Police Service currently has. Over 200 years, generally 100 or so years in Canada, we've been giving the police more and more and more responsibility without necessarily thinking whether or not they're the most appropriate institution to do that. And as one of my students said in class yesterday, in many instances, and Sandy brought this up earlier, we're funding them to fail.
Kika, what would you add to that list about changing attitudes around anti-Black racism in Canada?
I mean, I think we have to start asking questions about, well, why are the police doing these things to Black bodies? Alex Manassian was driving a van and using people as bowling pins on Yonge Street, not to be disrespectful to the lost lives or the people that were harmed. Dylan Booth went into a church, prayed with the parishioners, and then shot and then murdered them. Neither of these two people were taken. Both of these two people, were taken alive. And so, we need to be careful right in this moment, because this moment is really is even bigger than the police. So I totally agree with my colleagues around the police focus, but this moment is also about anti-Black racism in general. And so I don't want to take other institutions off the hook. The reason that a police officer can put his knee on the neck of a human being for 9 minutes and murder him in broad daylight is because of the larger issue of the devaluing of Black people's humanity, of Black life. And so when you talk about, what do we do next? We have to, first of all, acknowledge that. So moving past the denial, first of all, of whether structural and systemic racism is even real, to acknowledging that there's an undervaluing, a devaluing of Black life. And then the last step then is accountability for everybody, every system and every structure, from our government elected officials on down, for proportionality. Everything should be in proportion. And that ought to be the goal. So accountability is what we're asking for. And we're not taking any institution off the hook on anti-Black racism.
I want to follow up with you, actually, Kika, on that issue of other institutions. But before you do, I think it was Dylan Roof, not Dylan Booth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody out there named Dylan Booth will want the record corrected on that.
Booth. Sorry.
Okay, but follow up on that, Kika. I mean, we've seen Amazon, we've seen Nike, we've seen, large corporations express their solidarity with Black Lives Matter. What else would you like to see corporate Canada and corporate America do at this time?
Well, first of all, they need to hear that their statements we're grateful for their statements, but we're also frustrated by their statements, because none of the issues of structural and systemic anti-Black racism are new. So the next step then is, please show us, your C-suites and your boards, and show us your plan, your accountability plan, your strategic plan to change that, and allow us to hold you accountable. So set up a system and structure where our community in particular can hold you accountable for your progress in this area. So, out your numbers, out your data, and let's make this, a community project.
Roger, what else would you like to see from corporate America and Canada?
Yeah, more diversity and inclusion in the hiring process. And I used to be a recruiter, and I was frustrated in the organization that I was working in, because people would I have seen people ignore somebody's resume because they could not pronounce the person's name. That person could have been coming from Africa, Pakistan, or China, right? So, if that is systemic in one of the largest recruiting firms in the world, then how are you going to get hired into a corporation that they are representing? So it really starts with hiring. Yes, I definitely acknowledge that, show me your suite as well, show me how diverse, because really it starts with the tone at the top. So it has to be driven down from the leaders of those organizations, right down through every tentacle and every department.
I want to thank all four of you for joining us on TVO tonight. This was obviously a hugely important conversation to be having at this time. And it's our first trial run back here in the studio since the pandemic hit. And I'm very glad that it was this subject matter that enabled us to get back into the studio so we could have more voices heard. And I'm grateful to Sandy Hudson, Roger Dundas, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, and Kika Ojo-Thompson for joining us tonight. All good wishes to you all.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Steve. Nice to see you.
While today the U.S.-Canada border may be the longest undefended international boundary in the world, in the War of 1812, over 200 years ago, an island in Lake Huron was the scene of major conflict. With us now from the nation's capital on the significance of Mackinac Island, our Northeast Ontario Hub journalist, Nick Dunne. Hey, Nick.
Hi, Jan.
All right, so before we get into some of Ontario's history, let's talk about the War of 1812. Remind us who was involved and what led up to it.
Yeah, so it was part of the larger Napoleonic Wars, kind of a global conflict centered around Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte and its colonies. But this wouldn't actually have to do too much with Napoleon himself. At this time, the United States had just gone under the War of Independence, but the British were still kind of asserting themselves on the coast. They were really preventing a whole lot of trade from occurring across the Atlantic Ocean. So as all this conflict is going on, in Europe, it became a critical juncture for the United States to really assert some sovereignty and declare war on the British by attacking Upper Canada, Lower Canada, which we know today as Ontario and Quebec.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about that. How exactly was that region impacted and affected by this war?
Yeah, so Fort St. Joseph and Fort Mackinac are right by Sault Ste. Marie, kind of in the western part of Lake Huron. This is really, really far away, actually, from the main battles and the main theaters of war at the time. But this was also a critical juncture in the fur trade. That was the main, economic engine of our nation at the time. People would be able to go from the St. Lawrence River all the way to Lake Huron. That connects them to Lake Superior, which gets them to Western Canada. So very critical juncture, even though it was effectively an outpost for Europeans to, trade with and create relations with the Indigenous peoples in these areas. So that was the real significance of the area, even though it was so far away from those main theaters of battle.
So it's July 1812. I understand there is some double agents, there's some Indigenous groups and warriors, and maybe not so much bloodshed. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting conflict. So basically in June 18, 1812, war is declared. The United States declares war, but news of this war doesn't really get to Lieutenant Porter Hanks in Fort Mackinac, way out in northern Michigan at the time. Isaac Brock had been talking with Charles Roberts, the British commanding officer at the time at Fort St. Joseph, about declaring war, and there had been some back and forth. Thankfully, voyageurs, the fur traders at that time, were very skilled at traveling these networks, and they were able to pass information quite quickly, which was really helpful for us. And so about a month into the war, they finally get news that there's war and, go ahead to Fort Mackinac. It's a very, again, important fort, despite it being so far and relatively small. So at the time, though, the fort was garrisoned by a very small garrison, a lot of older troops. There's some reports of drunkenness and imbibing of substances, right? So they recruited voyageurs from the Northwest Company and a whole levy of troops from various Indigenous nations, including Garden River. And they stormed the fort, which you can see right here. Just kind of to the north of the fort was a very large hill. So they knew that's where, they could, seize this fort. And as all this is happening, there's a lot of, ships, canoes, action heading towards St. Joseph. And Porter Hanks sees this, and he's a little bit suspicious, even though he doesn't know there's a war going on. So he sends out a trader by the name of Michael Dousman out to kind of check out the scene at Fort St. Joseph. Dousman unfortunately gets captured, and they tell him, the British, to help us out, maybe clear out the civilian population, because Fort St. Joseph and Fort Mackinac were basically very close to each other. There are a lot of families, people married together. It was a very kind of communal area, even though we were, two different countries ostensibly. And so he does this. He doesn't notify the garrison, though, and they storm the north of the fort. They get out to the back, up on the hill. They set up some cannons, and without a single cannon shot, without a single gunshot, or any kind of casualty, it's one of the first engagements in the war, and they successfully take Fort Mackinac from Porter Hanks and the Americans. And this is a critical mistake that they didn't get to communicate with Fort Mackinac quick enough. This would, even though, again, relatively small engagement in the larger war, would play a pretty major role in securing these Indigenous alliances in northwestern and northeastern Ontario. And then from there, played a role in the siege of Detroit, where we actually captured Detroit for a brief period of time back then.
So we do have a painting that I want to pull up. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Again, this is, life on the fort. I think it really represents the Sault Ste. Marie area at that time. It was known as a gathering place, again, between voyageurs, between various American and European settlers and all these Indigenous nations at the time. A very kind of critical juncture in the fur trade, and a very unique area in this country at the time, where there was a lot of relations and a lot of reciprocity between, all these different groups.
Now, we should mention that Mackinac Island right now currently is obviously American. It was signed over during the treaty in 1815. But I do want to ask about lasting effects of this event. Is there any sort of lasting effect? Is there any kind of memorials as well in that area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Treaty of Ghent in 1815 kind of, set things aside, and it was effectively, nothing was really gained or lost particularly. But this helps secure, again, Northwest Passage out to Western Canada. So that's very significant there. Also, on the flip side, in securing that border, it kind of left those Anishinaabe nations along northern Michigan to deal with the United States. And this actually caused a number of communities there to resettle on Manitoulin Island, which isn't too far away from the area. That's the world's largest freshwater island, a very important and beautiful island out in Lake Huron, kind of a jewel of northern Ontario, really. So, even though this was a minor engagement and the war is kind of, come and gone, there are some pretty significant impacts that resonate to this day for many people, on Manitoulin Island, on St. Joseph Island, and Mackinac itself.
Nick, I want to thank you so much. I'm sure this is a story that not a lot of Ontarians know about, so thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I am Jan Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a good weekend, and NAM, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.